Ladies and gentlemen, this is NASA's Gemini IX press conference. At this time, I'd like to introduce NASA's Deputy Administrator, Dr. Robert Siemens, Jr.
I'd like to begin by saying the performance of Colonel Stafford, Commander Cernan, carrying out the Gemini mission was superior in every way. We have just awarded both astronauts the NASA Exceptional Service Medal for their accomplishments in Gemini IX, and have awarded to Colonel Deneen, who has been responsible for the Gemini launch vehicle, the same award. Gemini IX was an extremely interesting mission. It began after several delays with a virtually flawless launch and ended with a pinpoint landing. On the other hand, we found that there are still unforeseen difficulties to be overcome before we can operate at 100% efficiency in the space environment. As you know, some of these difficulties were procedural, such as the faulty cabling of the shroud covering the docking adapter. Others were technical, such as the Atlas booster failure that kept us from launching the Gemini IX the first time we attempted to go into the mission. Others were new and could only be experienced in space, such as the unanticipated expenditure of effort required by extravehicular activities. This extra effort on Gene's part saturated the suit environment system and led to the fogging of his face plate. This experience points up something we tend to forget. The Gemini program is experimental. As an experimental program, we try on each flight to advance to a maximum extent our understanding of space and how to operate in it. Quite often we've learned things we had not expected, and that is as it should be in an experimental program.
Well, to start with, we'd like to go back to the day when we attempted to launch with the Atlas Agena. It failed, and Gene and I came back down the elevator. And it seemed to me that we really got used to going up and down the east elevator of Pad 19. We got back to Houston the next day and sat down with the group headed by Chris Kraft, and we wanted to achieve all the major objectives that we could of the original flight plan. This would include 3 rendezvous. We thought that this was very important to have the 3 rendezvous and to feed over into the latter Gemini flights and also the Apollo flights. So within about 2 days we had made the analysis, came up with the trajectories, and it was, believe me, a great teamwork effort on part of all the people in NASA to achieve the new flight plan and trajectories in this period of time. And then we attempted to launch with the ATDA, or the target docking adapter. As you know, we did not get a computer update, and for the very sensitive nature of doing a rendezvous at third apogee, this was required. So Gene and I came back down the elevator again that day.
Our model at this point was we try harder and harder, and we tried harder, and this sort of carried on through our third launch.
You know, I think Gene was starting to think that I was jinxed. A long time ago, Wally Schirra and I went up and down the elevator a few times, and then after I'd been up and down the elevator with Gene, I finally decided what it was. It was Wally that was jinxed and Gene that was jinxed, and I wasn't the jinx at all. Well, after the target docking adapter got launched, we knew that there might be some trouble with the shroud, so the day before we actually launched, Gene and I went down to the hangar where they had Gemini X's shroud in assembly, and we went over every piece of this shroud with a fine-tooth comb, had about a 2-hour technical debriefing, so we knew every piece in there and knew what to expect once we got in flight. And finally, Friday morning, we got up the elevator again. Again, we got no DCS update, which updated our computer for launch, but by then we decided we might as well get out of town for the weekend, and we left rather suddenly there on Friday morning. From this point on, we completed the rendezvous as was prescribed. As you know, the Titan put us into an orbit below the docking adapter and about 650 miles behind it. And through a series of maneuvers that were calculated by Mission Control Center in Houston, we completed the first rendezvous. And Gene, you want to give them a few details on the trajectory?
Well, you might ask, why were we inserted in an orbit below the target? Well, this is the only manner in which we can actually catch up over a period of time with the target vehicle. If we had, for instance, launched just a few seconds later or even minutes later, we would have been far enough behind so that it would have taken even a longer period of time in terms of revolutions, or maybe even days, to catch up with the target vehicle. So we actually inserted exactly where we wanted to, about 600 miles behind the ATDA target, and eventually, after a series of maneuvers, to slow this catch-up rate such that we could be at a point at a particular time that we so desired. All this information was given to us from Mission Control as to when to burn and when not to burn very early. In other words, revolutions prior to our actual change from our orbit to the target orbit. These burns, certainly as Tom, who made them, will indicate, were very critical in terms of a mile per hour. For instance, on one side of the world can mean a miss distance of the target of several miles.
Well, we finally made the real critical maneuver on a rendezvous, which is called the transfer maneuver. In this, as you know, we're going approximately 18,000 miles an hour, and we ended up 12 to 15 miles below the orbit of the target and approximately 25 miles slant range. Well, we added 25 miles an hour to this total velocity of 18,000, and we came up in a maneuver below the docking adapter. One thing we transferred out in reflected sunlight. We could see this target docking adapter in reflected sunlight, and we transferred in reflected sunlight. As soon as it went into darkness, Gene and I could both see a flashing blue light, and right there we knew we were home free, because we couldn't see a flashing blue light if the shroud was on. What we didn't know was the shroud was in the position that it is. And we continued on. This was also the first rendezvous where we did a complete braking at night. We made the critical maneuver off the coast of Brazil, and a third of the way around the world we completed the maneuver, and we came up to it just past Australia and past midnight. Again, the target docking adapter was in this position, and we came up directly from below. And at approximately a half a mile, Gene called out, "I've got the cone lights." Now, the cone lights are the lights in here where you can make the docking. And again, even at a half a mile, we knew that this shroud couldn't be on here. However, we had a full moon, and suddenly it looked rather odd to us. And we came up to a position of approximately 1,000 feet. We could see this whole shroud out in reflected moonlight. And we reported this over Hawaii and moved into close formation. And we flew all the way around the docking adapter here. Particularly, we noticed the straps and these small items here that contain some explosive bolts. And from this close investigation, we'll have some movies to show you in a few minutes. We radioed to Houston through Hawaii exactly what our analysis was, and it came out correct that either the lanyards were not installed or else they were installed but not connected, and the latter was the proper case. From this, we went to the flight plan that we had worked on, And again, we said it's going to be a flexible type of flight plan. We had various entities in the flight plan, and we could take it and shift around each individual item, and that's exactly what happened. Neil Armstrong was Capcom at the time, and he said we'd go into the second rendezvous while Houston and the people at the Cape and also on the West Coast would make the analysis. From this, we went into a second rendezvous, which was the first pure optical rendezvous that had ever been performed, and it was on a passive target. And you want to show the maneuver on this, the separation. On this rendezvous, Gene made all the computations. We did not use a computer, and the radar was only for a monitor, but we did not use the radar as far as the braking. We started out and we got completely stabilized on top of the ATDA, and on Gene's mark, I burned about 15 miles an hour directly away from the center of the Earth. And naturally, that puts us above the ATDA, and when you're higher, you go slower. So we came around halfway around the world. We were 11 miles behind the ATDA, and then we crossed below it, came down 3 miles below it. Then at this time we rolled over upside down out in sunlight. Now we rolled over upside down so we could blank the sun out of our eyes and also have the docking adapter and reflected sunlight. And one positive approach of having the shroud, it became very obvious to us that the shroud had about 4 times the reflectivity of the rest of the vehicle. So in this case, the shroud really helped us out. On here. You can always find advantages to it some way, believe me. And also on the rendezvous from above, there was a shroud that we first picked up. In fact, we might have missed it completely if we hadn't had the shroud on it.
This was very important because we not only, as some of you know, we had a full moon on our flight. And not only could we see the bright colored white painted shroud in reflected sunlight, in other words, in sunlight that was coming over our shoulders and reflecting off the target so that we could see it, but actually after dark we could see not the silver part of the ATDA, but we could see the white shroud in reflected moonlight, which was quite a beautiful sight. It was sort of a bluish reflected light, and this is the first time we've ever actually seen anything in reflected moonlight. And being able to see the target visually so that Tom can track the target with his reticle is very important, not only to the computer for its calculations, but it's very important to the pilot so that he can make backup calculations. So having a shroud in reflected moonlight gave us quite a contrast as to what we can expect to see and what we cannot expect to see in different lighting conditions.
We completed this rendezvous again coming in from below. We were upside down and came in directly below the docking adapter. And again, we want to test how good can man visually judge distance. Looking up, even though the ATDA was slowly rotating like this, I could judge the length of this major axis. So it was approximately the length of the original Agena, and looked in the markings in my reticle, and I gave Gene a mark. I said we should be about 1 mile. Well, for data correlation, he hit the computer with the radar. We were 1.1 miles. So it was obvious that we could judge distance very accurately in close and continue on in. Now, with respect to rendezvous, again, we want to bring out the point that an optical rendezvous from short distances is feasible. It will cost you an excess of fuel, and the best way we know today is with radar. And from here, we progressed on, had a sleep period, and did the third rendezvous. And the third rendezvous was the one that is very important to our lunar program. It simulated a profile that the lunar excursion module could have with the command module. In this, we were positioned 150 miles out in front of the docking adapter and above it. Naturally, if we're above it, the docking adapter catches up with us. And we came along in space, blunt end forward. You want to take this, Gene? And track the vehicle looking down at it. In this case, we were approximately 8 miles above it. And when we reached 16 miles, we transferred. Now, we did have the docking adapter out in reflected moonlight, and it's probably one of the most brilliant bodies I've seen. Moonlight reflected off this white shroud and gave us a white circle, a whitish blue circle going across the Earth that was approximately 10 times the diameter of Venus, as you see in the sky. However, when it came out in the sunrise, we were going over the Sahara Desert, and we lost the docking adapter from a tremendous body down to nothing. The next time we saw it was approximately less than 3 miles, and at that time we're looking straight down in the Sahara Desert, and the docking adapter looked to me just like a period on a piece of typing paper. That's all it was. And it was, again, really whizzing across the Sahara Desert. At that time, when you point down, you know you're going 18,000 miles an hour, believe me. And without radar, we would have never found the docking adapter and completely missed the rendezvous. So this points out some of the problems that we're going to encounter on the lunar mission and exactly how we will approach the problem. And for any of you who are pilots, it's like making a high-side pass supersonic out over the desert on another aircraft. It's really a classic example of relative motion. Here you're looking down, seeing the Earth go by, and also you're moving with respect to the docking adapter.
I was just going to say that besides actually evaluating the technique of the rendezvous from above and what some of its problems may be concerning lighting conditions and when you actually want to change from your orbit to the target's orbit, and we'll get a good chance to see this, I think, in a minute, that the speed at which this target actually travels across the surface of the Earth. You don't appreciate this motion when you look up at the stars in the sky, but when you're looking down at the Earth, the target just really moves across the surface of the Earth. And the other difficulty we encountered, which Tom did mention subtly here, was the fact that at distances beyond about 3 miles, I believe it was, that the reflected light from the Earth, or the fact that the Earth itself is so bright, and there's many clouds scattered throughout the world, many different types of terrain, such as the desert that Tom mentioned, the target just completely disappears. You just can't find it, and we're accustomed to seeing, I think if we see an airplane in the sky, just even standing down here on the Earth, and we happen to have lost it because it went behind a cloud, we can look at the other end of that cloud, and the airplane in a short period of time will appear or reappear. But when looking down at the Earth traveling 17,000, 18,000 miles an hour, if you happen to see this particular target go over a lake, and then suddenly you don't see it any longer, you've lost sight of it, don't ever look back at that lake again, because it's probably many hundreds of miles beyond that. And this was one of the things we learned about actually visually tracking against a bright Earth background, or even more important, a bright moon background.
One thing that some of you probably heard, that on this rendezvous, we did use a closed loop where the computer makes lots of computations, but errors are built into any system, and every computer can only assume that the data coming into it is good. Well, in this case, the crew always makes computations on board, and we use Gene's computations for the transfer to make this maneuver. So I thought this was rather significant.
This probably only Tom and Dave Scott and a few others can really appreciate. This is what the pilot does on in the right-hand seat when the command pilot is doing all the flying. Many times I've been asked, well, really, what do you do on a rendezvous and what goes on? The meaning of these numbers is insignificant at this time. But during this period of time for all three of these rendezvous, this and the following chart, which you can go ahead and put down, are just some of the methods that we use to calculate where we are, where we're going, and how much increase in our velocity, how many miles an hour we have to add to the spacecraft at particular times in order to actually rendezvous and get within close proximity of the target. One thing that we had at our disposal was 3 separate, different, and distinct solutions to telling us what to do. The ground would compute a solution telling us exactly which direction to fire our thrusters and how fast or how far to fire them. Our computer and our radar combination gave us what we call our closed-loop solution. And then we have this type of information, which is just calculated with the pen and pencil. So we had at our disposal three displays of information at which we could superimpose and then decide upon for ourselves which actual solution was the one we wanted to burn based upon where we felt we were, and which solution would give us the most optimum and minimum fuel transfer. So in all of our rendezvous, we had this type of information. This type of information is computed, is gathered every 100 seconds for about an hour before the actual time when you make the maneuver. So for about a revolution around the world, this is what the pilot's doing prior to the actual transfer to the target orbit. A pencil in this case might be a single point failure, but we thought of that one.
This is the projection of the second rendezvous. Again, should we burn radially up above the docking adapter We went up above it approximately 3 miles, and we were trailing it by 11 miles halfway around the Earth, came back around, rolled over upside down, tracked it in reflected sunlight, made a small transfer maneuver of about 4 miles an hour, came in inverted, and broke optically. This whole part, this was just a setup for the final optical rendezvous, which is the first passive rendezvous ever been made. And the Gemini 10 crew will attempt to make an optical rendezvous using the Agena that's up there now, and it'll just be in a scale factor of about 3 of what we did here. So we got data to feed into the Gemini 10 crew, and also we learned a lot from this just later on if you do a rendezvous on an asteroid or some complete passive body in space. One real constraint, I mean, if you don't have flashing lights on a target, the only time you can do the rendezvous is out here in daylight. So at that altitude, we have about 53 minutes. This is the rendezvous from above. Again, we were coming along in a higher circular orbit. The target was in a lower circular orbit, and we were catching up to it, or it was coming to us. We made a maneuver, and again, a third of the way around the world. This was all out in daytime. We started down here out over the Atlantic Ocean, and we ended up going across the Sahara Desert, coming down and breaking over the Indian Ocean.
The contrast we were able to observe in the colors, I think, was very worthwhile information, because we had anticipated that silver paint actually would be almost equivalent to white in visual acquisition, but it certainly was not. And here again you can see what the ATDA or a target looks like against different backgrounds, against Earth background even up close, and against a dark black sky.
When we flew close formation, we had to get clear of the dipole antenna as the vehicle rotated around. So we rolled over upside down and came over and put our windshield about 3 to 4 inches from the strap and stabilized here to look at the explosive bolts. Here you can see the antenna rotating towards us.
Very soon you'll see a sequence here where the ground commanded the docking cone to rigidize, and when it rigidized, it actually changed the configuration of the alligator jaws very slightly.
Again, here we are rolled upside down, and we're just within a couple inches of it, as you can see each part.
Almost feel like you're going to get your nose snapped off here.
One thing is, we learned, and we saw this back on Gemini 6, the way that the Gemini windows are offset, when one individual gets real close to the vehicle, it's hard for the other individual to really see it. Here again, we're really in close, within a couple inches of it, and we're shooting right here on the connectors.
Tom was actually station keeping during this period of time on a rotating vehicle, which is something that we experienced slightly during Gemini 6 and 7, but of course with the Agena we have a continually stabilized vehicle and makes station keeping a great deal easier. So having a drifting or rotating vehicle was pretty much of a challenge, I think, and we both got a chance to take a good look at the station keeping.
I think this is a sequence when the ground sends commands, and you should see it move back and forth when they send the rigidized and unrigidized command. The shroud would move back and forth, and we could observe this and report it to the ground.
This now probably gives you a good feel for that spear in the belly of the alligator type of thing. I don't think we can really overlook the background of the horizon and the world behind it. It was just a tremendous background for all these pictures, and it never got old even after 3 days.
Here you can see Earth shine down below and sunshine up above, and the contrast you have between the two. It's a pretty classic example right there. And that's an exact time reference of the rate of rotation that the ATDA was doing.
What I'd like to do in the EVA, I feel that I must have been over it about 30 times in technical debriefings, and that's not my goal here today. I'd just like to run through very briefly what our plans were and what we did as we went along, just identifying where the problems were that we ran into, and then I would like to then summarize what we found out from encountering these problems in the real-time or actual flight situation, and what we've discovered since we've been here debriefing in Houston. We had a 2-day and 1-night EVA flight planned. We went through almost this entire period. We spent the first day on what we call umbilical evaluations, finding out what the capabilities of man were to maneuver on the umbilical, to use Velcro or sticky type pads and try and walk around the spacecraft, to use handholds on the spacecraft and find out what our capabilities or limitations of moving from one point of the spacecraft to the other, what these problems or difficulties might be, or what ease we had in maneuvering around the spacecraft. We also were investigating during this first daylight period, the operation of a new environmental control system, which is called we call the chest pack, or the ELSS. We've never flown this chest pack before in actual flight. It's somewhat different, has longer capability than what Ed White flew on GT4. So we were looking for the capabilities and reactions of this chest pack to keep cool, to ventilate, and to maintain certainly the required suit pressures that we would need for extravehicular activity. We did all this during the first day pass with no difficulty. We came back with some data and recommendations on umbilical evaluation, umbilical lengths, and how actually to handle yourself when floating in the near proximity of the spacecraft. We felt that the ELSS during this period of time on its medium flow operated very satisfactorily, and there was certainly a great deal of comfort on my part in terms of temperature control, in terms of total oxygen supply, and in terms of suit integrity. That is, my suit pressure never varied from what I had expected to see and what I had seen in our chamber runs here back in Houston. We then returned just towards the end of this period, had planned to return to the hatch area. We had the hatch open all this period of time. Returned to the hatch area, and we were going to make some film pack changes on the camera, on the extravehicular camera, which we did without any difficulty. I took the camera off the back or outside of the spacecraft and gave it to Tom, and he made some film and lens changes. We put the camera back in position. We had, again, somewhat of a problem keeping my feet where we wanted to. You may have heard pull me down, Tom, a number of times, and this was more of a convenience type thing, because my feet tended to float in places where I didn't really have a good foothold in order to reach. When you reach for something, you want to have either a toe hold or a hand hold, and many of these tasks that we were doing even at this period of time required two hands. So you have to restrain yourself in some fashion. This is why hold on to my leg, Tom, or pull my leg down, Tom, type of thing occurred during this period of time. We did make these changes, and we had a short rest period, which at that time was really not needed, because the amount of work done just in floating in and around the spacecraft and checking out the umbilical and putting in cameras and putting on rear view mirrors and other extravehicular equipment around the spacecraft is very slight, and it's very comparable to what you might expect to find right here in 1G. This is still daytime, and comfort of the pilot, my comfort was very fine. Tom had accelerated or exhibited his capabilities to operate pressurized within the spacecraft, which is something I think we all often tend to overlook. But he was now flying the spacecraft in what we call a hard suit. And in a hard suit, it's very difficult for him to move around and grab switches and move hand controllers. Apparently, he had little or no problems along these lines.
It's about the same thing as a Frankenstein monster trying to play Chinese checkers back and forth. It is rather clumsy. One thing with this that amazed me at the first, I'm sure all of you have gone swimming along with a boat, and when you want to get into a boat, even a good boat, size boat that weighs 4,000 and 5,000 pounds, when you reach up and grab a hold of it in the water, you tilt the whole boat. Well, down here on Earth, on a boat, you have water to damp it, but it became immediately clear to me that Gene was producing a lot of torque on the vehicle. And we're in real good communications, and when he'd come back on the adapter and get near the thruster section back here, I would turn off the control power. And in one 30-second period, he pitched me up 30 degrees. And then I had to slowly pulse back down and come back into the control mode. And when he finally went back into the adapter, I had the control mode off for approximately 3 minutes, a little over. We're going small and forward. In that period of time, Gene turned me around 150 degrees, rolled me inverted, and pitched me down 40 degrees. So I could tell he was putting out a considerable effort as far as torquing the spacecraft. However, I must say that even though we were upside down, pitched down, and yawed around, it made no difference to either myself or Gene because we went right through the work task as we had planned.
I might emphasize at this point that there's no doubt about the fact that it was pretty fantastic being out there. Just the fact that you had left the bounds of the spacecraft, and we were at that time some 180 statute miles above the surface of the Earth, and it certainly was a beautiful sight and something that I'm looking forward to very much to doing again. But there was absolutely no disorientation. I never felt lost. I never felt, although you're floating around on the umbilical and you sort of wish you did have a propulsion system at that time to go exactly where you wanted to go, I never felt that I lacked any capability to get back to the spacecraft at any time I so desired. It was pretty fantastic, certainly at this point, and I think I may have commented about that too. But continuing, we were in daylight, and continuing on with our desired work task as we had gone through many times and had them laid out, we now closed the hatch. We didn't lock it for a number of reasons, not that I didn't trust Tom, but we did have an umbilical coming out of the hatch, and we closed the hatch within 2 inches of being fully closed. And the main reason we did this was thermal control of hatch seals, of the interior of the spacecraft. You know, the temperatures go to both extremes of hot and cold, and we were concerned about keeping our hatch seal, for one thing, within limits of being soft, so we would have no problems closing the hatch. I might say that this was probably the first real work task or physical task that I encountered. That was of closing the hatch, of pulling the hatch closed, because here again, you just have 2 hands to work with, and you cannot restrain your feet in any fashion. But we did get the hatch closed, at which time I progressed back to the adapter section of the spacecraft, or the back end of the spacecraft. And for those of you who are not extremely familiar, we all here at MSC are, I know, but this adapter area is a white area of the spacecraft, and I progressed back from the hatch area after it was closed over the top of the spacecraft and back into this area right here. And this is where the majority of our work task were going to be done. The adapter is where the AMU was and where we did all this donning. Now we have this very adapter over here, and I'm going to step over here just for a second to give you an idea. You've heard about positioning problems, and some of you may have known what we were going to do prior to our flight, but maybe you might get a better idea. For purposes of relative simplicity, because I'm standing up, we have the adapter actually located vertically, but in reality, this is the top of the spacecraft right here. And so in space, I was roughly at 90 to 100 degrees laying sort of on my side. Now this was mainly because this is where the ATDA, or excuse me, the AMU fit into the adapter of the spacecraft. And this again, although when I got back there and I instead of looking down at the Earth, I saw the horizon of the Earth going across my side. This didn't bother me a bit. It didn't feel unusual, and it didn't hamper any of our operations. I actually came and brought the umbilical around the top of the adapter through this guide to make sure that it stayed clear of all thrusters, because as soon as I actually got around the edge of the adapter, Tom was now free to turn the thrusters on and put the spacecraft in a proper attitude of heads up, pointing forward. This was no real problem. You've seen pictures of the Gemini 6 and the Gemini 7 flight where there was a lot of conversation about all the debris that was hanging from the adapter. Our adapter was beautiful. There was not 1 inch of any of this encapsulating material, any of this plastic hose type things hanging down at all. The adapter, of course, was sharp as we anticipated it to be, and here again is why we brought the umbilical around the edge. Now, one of the first things we wanted to do, of course, was get in these stirrups right here, and with both feet in the stirrups. I don't mean to turn my back on you, but I'll just get here just for a minute. And this was our basic position to don the AMU, and all our work was pointed in this direction. This is why the spacecraft was my reference, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, whether we were pointed up or down had little or no effect. Now, by nature and by plan, and because we had trained this way, the majority of all our operations, there's many valves, which I won't go into, many harnesses, electrical and oxygen connections, many other details of the handrails that all take 2 hands to operate with. And we feel that just because we're extravehicular, there's no reason to go out there with 1 hand tied behind your back. In other words, you ought to be able to use 2 hands to accomplish any desired task, do any workload that you so desire. Well, we had gone through this in a zero-G airplane, and we knew pretty much what the problems were going to be. As a result, we did put these foot stirrups or retention so that your feet would not float up. Well, as it turned out, we did have a positioning problem, which I'll just identify and attempt to go into a little bit later, but we did have a positioning problem where I continued to float out of the stirrups and did not have freedom of both hands for any continued length of time. This is why, let me say this, as a result, I had to work continually against a pressure suit, against the stiffness of the suit, and this work then had to be taken out through the environmental control system. This is a type of work that was not really useful work, but it was work that I had to do to maintain my position. Well, about the time that I got here into the area and started working, connecting some hooks on a tether, the sun was just about to go down, and Tom, being in the front of the spacecraft, was almost in total darkness, and I was in total sunlight. And I immediately got very warm on the back, and I'll explain this in a minute, but I got extremely hot on the back, as a matter of fact, in the small of the back area. We stopped and took a rest until the sun went down, and then we continued on with some of our task of operating and donning the AMU. About this time is when my visor started fogging up, because this in itself is your life support. The problem then started as soon as it got dark. The visor fogged up. We had conversations back and forth about this. We knew what was happening, and it was just a case of continuing on, because we were not time limited. We actually had allowed 100% pad in terms of how long it would take us to do any task here on Earth or in the zero-G airplane. We doubled that time just so we know we'd have enough time. And I then just looked out into the black night. It was dark at this time, and there was no discrete difference between Earth and night. In other words, I could not actually see a horizon. I won't say I became a little lonely at this time, but as I was sitting there, we had 1 light instead of 2, again, which really didn't cause any problems. One of the lights just did not come on. The light appeared to me, as I was looking out my visor, as an automobile light coming through not a dense fog, but a misty type fog. So we discussed it, and this is a point at which Tom and I decided to abort the EMU mission, not knowing really how far we could get. Believe me, this is a real ride. Tom knew what to look for, and I had been told what to look for, but it's very difficult to describe, and I know those of us who have been there just hope everyone could always have this chance. It's just fantastically beautiful and something you can never repeat here on Earth.
So look out, all I can say, it scares me. Gene,
that's what you get for going twice.
Yeah.
I was too new to me to be scared.
Gene obtained the first 3.5 minutes. I obtained the last 3.5. So at the time we were shooting pictures and watching the needles and flying the spacecraft. Kind of a busy job.
Just backing up a minute to when retrofire occurs, it was quite an experience just to have those retrofires. But when they do, there's no doubt about the fact that you're coming home. You may not know exactly where right away, but there's no doubt that you're on your way.
Now, at this time, I'm pulling nearly full lift. We had 2 hot retros, and so we lifted in quite a ways to the carrier. And full lift in Gemini is upside down. Your feet's against the sky, your head's in the earth. And we're banked about 20 degrees off the complete upside down position. We finally come into where it would be our zero lift line, and to get zero lift, we roll the Gemini. And you'll see this shortly. I put full controller deflection in, and we start to roll.
The G-forces at this time are building up so that you're actually forced back into the back of your seat.
Now we're starting to roll. We've reached the zero lift line. We know we should pull about zero lift, and the Wasp should be down in front of us there about 300 miles away. And we're rolling around about 15 degrees a second. You'll see a black shock come over and make a tremendous hot spot on the nose section. Where you see there. See that shock burning on the nose? Well, this is the final part of it. We're on the chute right in front of the Wasp.
All this time, Tom kept asking, are we on television? Are we on television?
Deke Slayton accused me of being a ham for asking that question. We knew we were right on top of the Wasp. We had some fire in our RCS thruster, so we came down in a single-point attitude for nearly 4,000 feet before we went down to the 2-point. When we hit, you can see we are oscillating on the chute, and there's some big swells down below, and we hit like a ton of bricks. Now watch this. We'll send a geyser of water up in the air of about 30 feet. We went way under the water. Stand by. You see, there was no doubt when we hit the water.
That was the other indication we were home.
Well, we jettisoned the chute right away, and shortly thereafter we were picked up by the carrier Wasp. So we had the same admiral and same captain that I'd seen there last December. So a couple of happy individuals there after 3 days. We had a pretty good weekend out of town.
It should be running 16, it's been running 6.
Could you speed the camera up a little bit, please? We want to see that big.
There's no indication who the command pilot of this flight was. All you see is a hand from the other side occasionally come around. I think that's being played too slow.
Here we come up and meet Admiral Leonard and Captain Hartley.
You can imagine the stories that were going on during that few minutes.
Told him it had improved his navigation considerably since Gemini IX. One thing that did help us on this, the computer gives you steering all the way down, but right at the last it calls full lift, and you know you're going to, if you have all the needles snowed, you're within a couple of miles. But Gene and I had worked out this technique that when he could finally get his hands up there, when the G field reduced down, he could read out latitude and longitude, and we interpreted this at the last. And the computer told us full lift, but Gene said no, roll full negative. So I rolled the Gemini 180 degrees and pulled negative lift right at the last. I'd say this probably saved us about a half a mile.
Well, we'll go right into the Q&A, and please wait for the microphone. Dave?
Shoemaker with CBS. You did not refer to this fatigue problem that caused you to delay EVA a day. Who was tired and what had made you tired?
Well, 3 rendezvous in 21 hours. And also with that, it's like anybody, you know, you go to sleep at night, and sometimes you sleep good, other times you don't sleep good. Well, there were several factors beside this that really entered into it. We were rather bushed, like we said, we talked it over after the 3rd rendezvous, but also the fuel, after completing 3 rendezvous, our fuel budget was rather low. We did have a lot of experiments on board we wanted to perform, and station keeping on the unstabilized body, there was a chance that we could really reduce our fuel budget down lower than what we had originally planned. All associated with that too, Gene and I had worked out this detailed investigation of extravehicular activities, specific work tasks, and if we'd go over to the ATDA at that time, we weren't sure that we could get the shroud off because we knew of you'd have to cut 2 of those cables, plus you'd have to then open the jaws up, get inside, and probably pull 2 connectors. And so we added everything up, the fuel budget, and also the increased fuel. We were slightly fatigued, and we wanted to devote full time and attention, and when we were station keeping, this would probably detract from it. So it was a series of factors.
You mentioned considering trying to get rid of the shroud. Do you think now that you could have gone ahead safely and either bumped it off or cut it off?
I think that from what we know now, we made the right decision because of the body positioning difficulties that Gene encountered. And here with the lower mass, this ATDA, he would have probably gotten a hold of it and sprung up on him and have a hard time positioning himself to perform a specific task.
We had, as you know, while we were up there was an investigation by a couple of our guys out on the coast, taking a real good look and in talking to them. It was one of those things that maybe could have been done and maybe not could have been done, strictly from the physical requirements of cutting the shroud off, because there were a number of electrical connectors that could not be reached unless other things had been done previously. So it was a maybe situation. And as we looked at it, we had an EVA flight plan that both included a target vehicle or was versatile enough to not include the target vehicle, and it really didn't compromise the plan. So our feeling was if we could get the shroud off to give us an opportunity to dock, we'd go ahead, but if not, there was no real good reason then to do EVA at that time. So looking at it now, I think the shroud, we probably could not have got the shroud off because of the physical requirements of the shroud and also because of EVA activity in terms of rotating bodies and non-stabilized bodies and positioning.
Gene, what do you feel are the lessons from your EVA experience in terms of Gemini 10, 11, 12, and long-duration EVA missions?
Well, I'll work backwards. I don't think in terms of long duration, if we're talking about 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, if we have a life support system and we take ample, we pace ourselves so that we're not working against a hard or pressurized suit, I feel no problem in long-duration missions at all. In terms of dehydration or anything else. Now, what lessons have we learned? I've tried to depict some of the things we've learned, and the things as far as Gemini 10, 11, and 12 are concerned, I've been going over with all 3 of these pilots and working specifically with them on some of their details and some of their particular flight plan problems that they may have not anticipated, that hopefully I can say, really, this is not going to be as easy as we think it is. So we'd have to go into each one of those flight plans in detail, Jules, to say what we've learned. I think a great deal, though.
But as a broad guide, do you feel a man has to move more slowly, take things easier, or what during EVA?
Well, primarily, I think, number one, if we're going to do any transferring from one vehicle to another vehicle, we want a propulsion system. I'm not saying what kind of propulsion system, but I'm saying that the umbilical or a tether in terms of being used to get from one place to another is not adequate. I think we knew this. I think this was just a verification of that. I think we definitely want a propulsion system. I think in terms of maneuvering around our own vehicle, just getting to that propulsion system, I think we want some positive handrails or handholds or something that gives us positive control of our body attitude at all times. Another thing we're probably interested in is what are the problems of going to a non-stabilized body and giving it a slight perturbation or impulse when you actually hold on to it. Now, is this going to rotate the body? Is it going to destabilize the body? We've got to feel for this, because one thing we did learn was that all these things, that these negligible and very small second, third order forces and terms now have to be considered, because everything it's old Newton's law, every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and this came home to us very solidly during the EVA on Gemini 9.
You also have to make sure you have a proper restraint system and make a complete analysis of the force vectors that are going to be applied for each task you do.
I suppose the last part is for Dr. Gilruth. Is the chest pack being modified or changed anyway to increase its capacity, sir?
Jules, I think both things have to be done. I think we have to reduce the workload by providing better body restraint while you're doing tasks. You must realize that this is really the first flight in which people tried to do something in the way of work in space. We've floated around before, but this is the first time anyone's really tried to put out foot-pounds in space. And so I think that both things need to be done. We have to see if we can increase the capacity of the chest pack, because we know now that you can defeat it by working extremely hard, as Gene did. But it's not reasonable to work this hard in space. So we have to reduce the difficulty, or what he calls the inefficiency of trying to position his body without sufficient handholds and footholds and restraint while he's trying to do a fairly complicated task. I think this is really the basic lesson.
Hal Bamford of Powerhouse. Tom, you talked about the degree of difficulty in visually obtaining the ATDA from above.
Right.
Has this led you to any recommendations for the LEM?
Well, I think it verified what was brought out on the decision as far as the prime instrument for rendezvous on the LEM, and that's radar. And so we know that we've made the right decision by having radar on the LEM to take care of the type of rendezvous when you're above or below. So this just verified what we thought the assumptions were.
Gene, from what we've been told about the 10, 11, and 12 EVAs, it doesn't seem like 10, 11 is comparable to yours, but that 12 is. And I was wondering if you've come up with any specific suggestions for handholds or some kind of restraints that would reduce this workload. And then the second thing is, you mentioned that you talked to the 3 pilots. And could you tell us who the third one is?
Thank you, Jim. Now, I haven't really talked to the 3 pilots that are concerned. I must retract that. I have talked to the 2 pilots, the 10, 11 pilots, because I can't tell you who the 12 pilot. I can tell you it isn't me. That may help. But back to your first question, yes, we are looking, and we feel that the restraint system, the bars and the footholds that we have now, are not adequate for the 12 flight. We have not yet decided what is adequate, because we're pretty much of the feeling that let's find out really how inefficient these bars are and where other bars or footholds or handholds might be more efficient and allow us to do the same job with half the work.